community management isn't something you can keep sort of having a shot at. It takes a really long time, and if you don't lay the foundation for it to start with properly, you can end up with a lot of problems in your community. I'm sure we've all sort of been to forums or blogs where there's a lot of nasty comments, or, you know, like problematic sort of behaviour in community can be really hard to change retroactively. So lots of times we see people sort of waiting, I'll get a full-time community manager later when the community's established, but often by then there's sort of too many problems. So I see that we're just in this really good position now, which is really exciting as community managers. What I find quite interesting though is that being that we all sort of work in digital, we're always looking forward, we're trying to predict trends, we're trying to see what's around the corner. And as a result of that, we tend to think that community management is new, when in fact people have been doing this for about 3 decades now. So, and you know, these people are still around and they've got a lot to share. One of the speakers we have this year at Swarm is a guy that community managed the Well back in, I think he was around in like 1988 to 1992. So there's definitely a lot of learnings there, and there's also decades of academic research about how people participate online, why they participate online. So, you know, that covers sort of sociological, psychological, anthropological. There's just so much research that we can tap into. But I sort of see people getting caught up in social networking's the new thing. We're doing this brave new world and people are communicating. But, you know, with human behaviour ultimately doesn't change. So I sort of want to talk about the adventure of community management, like as a journey, as I see it. I was going to talk about the weirdness and wobbles, and I think that's actually in my title there, but I sort of think it's more useful, hopefully, to all of you to sort of talk about where community management's going. I've certainly got a lot of weird and wobbly stories about our time in community management. I've done a lot of, having worked with communities for 10 years, there's definitely a lot of stories there from, you know, moderating the live stream from Big Brother that goes to people's handsets. So, you know, nothing quite makes you sort of make quick judgment calls like a 30-second delay. I've worked on Central Baby for 2 years, which is one of the largest forums in Australia and has 250,000 members. So a ton of stories. We do work with SBS, and I'll go back to where you came from. So one of the biggest challenges that I see with community management is that brands don't recognise the value of it. And we see this played out in a whole host of ways, such as hiring a junior or tacking it onto someone that already has an existing job, or sort of spreading it around the department. And people aren't really sure, and they're not sort of recognising the seniority that it requires. So I think, you know, with social media, it went from the nice to have to the necessity, and we went from sort of dipping our toe in the water to sort of maybe being, you know, chest deep, and some of us are out there swimming. But it really is a long-term goal to build a community, and the way that I see it is that you are building one of the most important assets for your brand. So there was a tweet yesterday that came out of the Lithium session where they sort of said user-generated content will become the biggest asset, and those two things obviously go hand in hand because they're coming out of your community. So the person that is your community manager is tasked, as I see it, as building one of the biggest assets for your company. So it's worth thinking about sort of how you treat that role. The next sort of thing that I want to talk about, I think, on the point of value, we're sort of seeing a lot of community managers feeding back to us that they don't have they either have limited resources or they don't have enough executive level support. And that's been reflected in both research that we've done here in Australia, but also some reports that have come out of the US. So I think, you know, I know a lot of community managers obviously through the groups that I participate in, but we're seeing, you know, community managers, they get up on Saturday morning and they check their community, or they check it at Saturday night, you know, they're checking it on the weekends, they're checking it all the time. You know, and this isn't a scalable solution, obviously, in the long term. And I sort of say to these guys, it's very hard for the business to sort of determine ROI around community building efforts if you're sort of working all the time for free. And, you know, we see a lot of sort of burnout in the industry because often the community managers in the trenches dealing with a lot of negative content and stuff like that, so it can really wear them down. Recognising the value, supporting the community manager are two things that I think is something that we need to see change in the industry. So this leads me on to sort of the next thing that I consider a real challenge for community managers, which is Facebook. So Facebook, I hate to say it, is actually a terrible platform for building community. It's woeful, and anyone that's ever built community on any other platform knows that. And I think it's, it obviously has a lot of great things about it as a marketing platform. You can't sort of argue with the data that you can collect, and how targeted you can make your campaigns and so forth. So it definitely has a place to play, a role to play. But in terms of community building, I think there are a lot of better things out there, and possibly a lot of better things sort of around the corner. So the issue also with community management on Facebook is that it's really a lot of community managers so far, it's all they know, which is understandable. But often I wonder if they're sort of going to be able to, pack up the skills that you've learned on Facebook and sort of trundle them off to a new platform. And I sort of predict that being an issue, because a lot of community managers working on Facebook spend a lot of time, optimizing ad campaigns or working how to game edge rank or things like that aren't really a natural fit for a thing that you would have to do sort of in a forum or another environment. So I think, again, that speaks to my point about community managers sort of recognising what they can learn from the past and what they can learn from other platforms to make sure they're sort of protecting their own skill set, but also potentially, there are risks to the brand around what happens if, our false god Mark Zuckerberg falls. So this, of course, leads me on to the next point, which is branded or owned communities. I really think the smart brands are going to start recognising the value in having a platform that they own, that they have more control over, that they can sort of decide how and when and where and why they interact with their consumer. And there was a great session yesterday from the Lithium guys. So I really, I think that, although I don't think there's going to sort of be a land grab for communities anytime soon, I do think that you can build a community around your brand, or you can build a community around that category. Obviously, if you wanted to go into something like parenting, you would see that there's already, it's a very saturated space. There's so many large parenting communities already out there, and nothing sort of gathers a crowd like a crowd. So it's very hard to sort of top the biggest communities out there. Johnson & Johnson also already have a parenting community, so they've sort of owned that space as far as communities go. But I do think that if that's where we're going, it's definitely worth brands sort of considering that it's such a long-term goal that if and when this land grab does happen, or maybe you can go and acquire an existing community, it's just something that people need to keep in mind, I think, as far as community management goes.